So we've been working with adaptive leadership for a couple of years with people who want to become administrators, people that are administrators, and one of the things I'm wondering about is if there's a simple, maybe hear your explanation of the idea of adaptive challenges and technical problems. How do you?
Well, I like to use some metaphors to help people think about the difference, because it's hard. I mean, one way to say it is that technical problems live between here and here, and adaptive challenges live between here and here. But I use a medical metaphor, which I find really, at least for me, it's really clarifying. So you break an arm. Neither you or I are competent to fix a broken arm. But we both know how to access someone for whom it's perfectly straightforward. So it's a classic technical problem. Very complicated, very complex, but we have experts who can fix that problem, can solve that problem. So let's say you go to a doctor and your problem is not a broken arm, but it's high blood pressure. Now, high blood pressure is like most problems. There are some technical aspects to it, and there are some adaptive aspects to it. The technical aspects are, doctor can provide some pills, but the doctor can't exercise for you, she can't eat better for you, she can't reduce your stress. You got to do that yourself. And so the locus of work begins to shift to the person with the problem rather than the expert fixing. Now then you face a more complicated situation. You go to the doctor and your, God forbid, diagnosis is a terminal disease. Then there's nothing, the doctor's expertise, all her training, all her talent can't help. All the work is the work of the family and the patient. Right? That's a more classic adaptive challenge, right? Where all the work is on the part of the people with the problem rather than someone they can hire to fix it. That's one way of thinking about it. We are prone to understand problems as technical problems because there's someone who can fix them.
Sure.
Right? And adaptive challenges require us to do work that we'd prefer to have some consulting firm do, or a boss do, or mom and dad do.
So I've never thought of it that way. So technical sort of outside, adaptive's inside, and that's why it's more than just from here up. Yeah, because there's something you have to do about
values, beliefs, self-identity. If you're a school principal and you're having to fire a teacher or take away some responsibilities, you're changing people's identity, their sense of themselves. I use the example a lot of my mother, who's now 101.
Fantastic.
But she was driving in her mid-90s, and she shouldn't have been driving in her mid-90s. And if you talk to her for 30 seconds about her driving, you would know that for her, it was part of her identity. And for her to stop driving would rip part of her heart out. I mean, she knows that old people shouldn't be driving in her head, but
it's okay.
But the resistance to stopping driving is not coming up here; it's coming in here, right?
It's her independence.
Yeah, and she said to us at one time, my brother and me, she said, "If I stop driving, I will be diminished and I will feel diminished." And she was absolutely right.
Yes.
She stopped driving and she feels diminished, and her life is diminished. So that the resistance that people get when they're trying to lead difficult change is not because people don't understand it. It's because people do understand it and they don't like it. Right? We tend to, if someone doesn't like our fabulous idea, we tend to talk a little louder. Right?
And repeat it.
Yeah, repeat it. Or add more facts, or some more sources and references.
Absolutely, yes, what we would do. Right. Yes, believe my logic.
Yes, right. But you're appealing to the wrong part of the anatomy. That's not where the resistance is coming from. And most of us are not trained to play around with people's hearts and values and belief systems. We're trained to play around with people's logic systems.
We're trained to avoid it.
Yes.
Actually avoid it, and just stick to things that are measurable.
Well, and particularly in a school environment, an educational environment where you're supposed to be dispassionately
Yes.
looking at information.
Mm-hmm. So that makes me think about one of the challenges that principals have, I think, in schools, or administrators in schools, is around the idea of setting objectives, setting, you know, this goal in mind. I'm not sure how to ask the question, but I guess it's along the line of how does this idea of being adaptive sort of weave into the idea of setting objectives? Because objectives to me just sound like real, like concrete,
Right.
specific, and adaptive sounds like something that is moving around and changing.
Well, there are two things that occur to me when you say that. The first is, I think any strategic plan is just somebody's best guess at the moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So an objective is not something that's set in concrete. In the level of abstraction, you know, end world hunger is an objective, but it's a very high level of abstraction. Get 150 people to go to food pantries next week is a much more concrete, but it's an objective. You know, you can call them both objectives. The more abstract the objective is, the more people can invent what it really looks like. When you're dealing with an adaptive issue, the pathway between here and there is not going to be a straight line. In fact, because adaptive issues are emotional, sometimes you're going to feel like you're not making any progress, or you're actually going in the wrong direction. The other thing about adaptive work that's different than technical work, so let's say you're skiing and you break your leg. At the moment you break your leg, you have the temperature is as high as it's going to be. You know, you're in enormous pain. You're freezing cold. People are skiing by you and they're pretending they don't see you. You know, but eventually those nice folks come with a blanket and a shot of whiskey, and the temperature goes down, and you get to the hospital, and you have to wait for a while for the doctor. But finally, the doctor comes and fixes you. And that's a technical problem. Typically, the intensity is right at the beginning, and then you get back to status quo. With an adaptive challenge, part of the problem is people don't think there's a problem. Hey, life is good, you know, don't mess us up. So when a principal or a school administrator or a teacher, for that matter, is trying to lead change in their institution, they're pushing against the status quo.
Absolutely.
Which means that almost always you have to, what the language we use is put some heat in the system in order to get people to pay attention. Right? And it is a disruptive activity. I think that's the right word, you know. So that when you're trying to lead adaptive change and you put some heat in the system, you can't control where it's going to come out. And if you're a school principal and you want to get from A to B, you better be prepared for B1, B2, and even C. Right? Because once you start disrupting the system, you're not going to be able to manage that process the way you would if you were dealing with a technical project.
And it's unpredictable. There are going to be all kinds of possible options coming up, things you didn't think of, emergent qualities. That's uncomfortable.
And which suggests to me that it's really an iterative process. That you make a move, you see what happens, then you decide whether to make another move. Maybe you make a mid-course correction. Maybe you go back a little bit in order to go forward. You know? But it's not charging ahead. You know, that's not what leadership really is.
It's not.
And yet we tend to think about leadership as you know, one person you know, leading the army.
Here we go.
You know, the word leadership, interestingly, comes from a Greek word L-E-I-T, leet, which means go forth and die. So
fabulous, isn't it?
The danger,
quite heroic.
The danger of leadership is built in. You know, which is why you, Kendall, and I don't do it as many more than we do. Right?
No.
You know, and the work that you're doing is trying to help people exercise leadership more often than they have on behalf of what they care about.
And one of the things people sometimes struggle with is the idea of, again, it's language, but there's leadership, and there are leaders.
Yes.
And what's your What's your hunch about
I try to never use the word leader for two reasons. One is a semantic thing, because I think leadership is a behavior, not a person.
Absolutely.
And so I like to get people to think about what it looks like, not who it looks like. The second thing is that we tend to conflate leadership with having a big job. And I think you can exercise leadership from any position in any organization. It doesn't make any difference where you sit in the organization. How you do it will be different depending on where you sit in the organization, what your resources are, what your constraints are. My experience, Kendall, I don't know, and my observation, I don't know if you agree, is that we don't see very much leadership from people with big positions because they all have golden handcuffs, you know. Life is good, and leadership is risky. And so why, if you've got a great job and you're making big money and you've got lots of power, why would you put that at risk?
Why change?
Yeah.
This
So
is a pretty good cruise.
Yes, right, exactly. So you see, you know, it's not surprising to me that we think of people like Gandhi and Mandela, and Martin Luther King, who exercised leadership with no job at all. You know, they didn't have a big job,
No,
right?
they didn't.
Which gave them enormous amount of flexibility as to what they could do. You know, people who exercise leadership with big jobs get in trouble. You know, Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin. You know.
So let's talk about an adaptive issue in schools. An example of one maybe to be concrete with, and just maybe walk through a little bit what identification and diagnosis might look like, or the idea of orchestrating conflict, or holding steady.
Well, I'll give you a kind of an example. I'm working with a fellow now who is trying very hard to change the culture of an educational institution. He feels very strongly, he's not the senior official, but he's in the hierarchy. He feels very strongly that the institution is falling behind its peers. It's not serving its students very well. And he has been trying lots and lots of different things. And what he's begun to realize is that the way the institution is organized and functions now is serving the interests of most of the people in the institution. So the students aren't pushed very hard. The faculty is allowed to teach the stuff that they know how to teach and not push beyond that stuff they've been teaching for 20, 30 years.
That works for these kids.
Yes. Or at least gets them to pass a certification exam, right? And what he's finding, it's very interesting. He, 4 years ago, his wife went shopping and was crossing the street in their hometown and got killed. And he said he spent the next 2 years grief counseling his children. He said to me, now I'm in the same business. I'm in the grief counseling business. He said, because I'm trying to help this institution go from a place that, even though it's, from my perspective, it's not working very well, it's comfortable for people, it's familiar, to some place that's unfamiliar and new to them. And they are feeling an enormous amount of threat and a sense of loss. You're taking faculty people who live by their reputation of competence and knowledge, and you're asking them to step into the unknown. That's very, very scary for them. So when you're trying to lead change in a school, even though it's obvious to you that it's not working, it's not so obvious to the people who figured out how to accommodate, how to work in that environment. You know, one of my favorite definitions of leadership is about the distribution of loss. And if you are trying to lead change, it's really important that you recognize the resistance as a signal that you are delivering losses to people, and they're your responsibility. And if you're going to be successful, you have to help them deal with those losses.
And so those losses, to me, they have a lot to do with connecting to the conflict. And one thing that we talk to people about is that conflict is not a goal of adaptive leadership. Conflict is the result of adaptively influencing a system. Right. And so you regulate that conflict, which, well, can you talk a little bit about regulating that? Because people are going to be in conflict when they have to give up a lesson or give up a textbook or a way of doing something.
A way of being in the classroom, a way of dealing with kids, all the stuff that, well, I think that's right. And we tell people in senior authority roles that they are moving from the business of resolving conflict, being the deciders, to use W's phrase, to orchestrating conflict. Well, what does it mean to orchestrate conflict? It means that your job is to try to get the people in the system to address the value conflicts that are holding them back, and to create what we call a holding environment, a safe space where people can express their hopes and their fears, and so those all can be negotiated out. Because if people hold them back, then you, trying to exercise leadership, never know what you're dealing with. So we encourage people, instead of seeing themselves as resolving conflict, making decisions, to see themselves as nurturing those value conflicts, surfacing, allowing them to play themselves out, so that the organization, the people in the organization, have a not so welcome opportunity to confront each other over those difficult value choices.
So the idea that it's a mindset shift. At one level, the leader is not responsible.
The person in authority, you meant to say.
Yeah, that person too. They're not the person to implement the solution. They're the person to organize, to orchestrate the conflict. Because the solution is probably going to come out of the thinking of a group. And the idea that maybe orchestrating a conflict with a group of 100 people is a great challenge, so you create a holding environment that might be a subset of that group.
Yes, that's perfectly reasonable. And one of the realities is, for people in authority, is that those folks would rather have you make the decision than take that responsibility themselves. The downside of that is they're likely to come up with something that isn't exactly the same as what you would have come up with.
Absolutely.
But the benefit of that is that it's theirs, not yours. You know, it's like when you have two kids and they're fighting with each other, and you go to try to break up the fight, or they come to see you. All they want is you to side with each of them.
Absolutely.
Right? And once you say, you know, I think it was your fault or your fault, then you become the issue. The issue isn't the issue anymore, right? It's about you. When two people come into your office and say, we can't get along, right? And you decide whose fault it is, then you become the issue, right? It's about you anymore. It's not about the issue. What they're afraid of, what those kids are afraid of, is that you'll say, you know, go into this conference room over there, I'm going to lock the door, and I'm going to shove pizzas under the door until you guys have worked this out. You know, that's what they don't want. Because once you decide, then the issue is whether are you with me, or you love me, or you love him, you know.
And that's messy.
Yes.
That's very messy.
So one of the core ideas here is to be conscious of giving the work back to people. And people who become principals of schools have been problem solvers. They're good at it. You know?
They're paid for it. They got promoted to do it.
That's right. And they're rewarded for it. Mr. and Ms. Fix-Its. And part of this work, it isn't, we're not talking about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're just saying you've got to tweak your practice and be open to the possibility that what you should do in this situation is give the work back to them rather than take it off their shoulders and make it easy for them.
In a place I think this fits so nicely in education is that as teachers, we know that what we don't know. We sometimes come from the position that if we can create some disequilibrium in the mind of the student, it's what helps them learn, right? We push them to the point that they're uncomfortable, but below the capacity that they'll burn out, and it's Vygotsky's moment in a sense. And I think having principals, or even any member within the group, understand that what would it look like if we disrupted ourselves to that point of discomfort.
Yeah, that's a great observation, I think, because it is leadership is a disruptive activity. And you want to try to keep the disruption in a productive range. Because if there's not enough disruption, then people are not going to address the issue. If there's too much disruption, the place blows up. Right?
Absolutely.
And so one of the metaphors that I find useful is think of yourself as having your hand on the thermostat. You can raise and lower the temperature, right? Depending on what you think will be productive.
It's not always about being right, then.
No. In fact,
it's another place people need to step back.
One of and particularly difficult in an educational institution where right answers are at a premium, you know, because what makes adaptive issues difficult is that there isn't a right answer. There are value choices where you can't hire an outside consultant to tell you what you ought to do.
No, you need to value this.
Yeah, that's right. Right.
That doesn't work.
And it's about making really difficult choices about who we want to be, whether you're talking about a school or a community or a family, you know. And it's those unresolved value conflicts that keep individuals and organizations locked in place.
So when I think about values and I think about, you know, people within the organization, the person of position, and it makes me wonder about how a person works through the element of hold steady or holding steady. Is that about what they believe in? Is it about what they know?
I think it's about recognizing that if you're a principal of a school or a teacher in a school or an administrator in a school, that is a role that you're playing at a moment in time. It's not who you are as a human being. And playing a role, whether it's mom or dad or interviewer, interviewee, there's nothing phony or inauthentic about it, but it is a role which requires you to behave in certain ways and to meet the expectations of those roles and perform certain functions. The consequence of that is that what comes at you in a workplace, in a professional workplace, is not about you, but it's about the role that you're playing. And one of the classic ways of diverting you from what you're trying to accomplish is by coming at you personally, you know? So when someone says, Marty Linsky, you are the worst facilitator I have ever experienced, you've got to be able to get yourself in a place where you can say, that's really interesting that you would say that. I'm sorry you're having such a bad day. Now let's get back to talk about what we're talking about. Right? And I think, Kendall, I think it goes the other way. When someone says to you, hey, Marty Linsky, you are the most fantastic facilitator, and there's a little voice in your head which says, I'm okay, but I'm not that good. Right. Exactly. You're being worked in the same way. People do not criticize you when they like where you're going.
Oh, no. Not at all.
Have you ever been criticized for your style?
All the time.
Right. Have you ever been criticized for your style when you're handing out a check?
Oh, no.
No, that's right. People do not come at you personally when they like what you're doing.
No, that's so true. So the idea of holding steady, then, is that you have these identities, these professional identities. Some of them are not who you are. Some of them you're aware of. Others, people come at you with them.
Right.
And are you suggesting that that there is something core that's universal to all, or that each one of them has things you will hold steady to, values you will hold steady to?
Well, I think that's where it comes around, is the capacity to not get diverted and to not get taken out or pushed aside or marginalized.
for what you believe in? Or your
Well,
actions?
it requires you to believe in something.
Yeah.
It requires you to have a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot separate leadership from purpose.
Mm-hmm.
They're inextricably tied together. So one of the resources for holding steady in the face of conflict, in the face of setbacks, in the face of personal attack, is that you care deeply about something that you want to see through fruition, to fruition. And for some people, and I don't begrudge them this, for some people, hey, they have a good job, good wage, lots of people would change places with them in a minute. They don't have any sense of purpose other than maintaining what they have. People who want to try to exercise leadership come to that because there's something that they care about. There's some gap between their aspirations, not for themselves, but for their school or their community, and the current reality. And that closing that gap is a leadership challenge.
And they may see it as a moral wrong. The gap is a moral wrong, so
Yes,
they're acting on it.
Well, yes, whether you call that aspiration moral or principled, or it's something they care deeply about. And leadership is very personal in the sense that you gotta believe in it. I think there's a paradox that you both have to be totally committed and to be open to the possibility that you're dead wrong.
Absolutely.
Right. But you've got to be totally committed, because if you aren't, you won't take the necessary risks, and people will see that.
I've heard some people talk about holding steady, and how would you respond to this? That some people will think about holding steady as a place where they either put their stake in the ground and say, this is a principle I'm holding on to and I'm not going to waver from, or this is what I believe in and I'm not moving from it. It's almost a heroic stance.
Yes.
I'm not thinking that's what you
Well,
were writing about.
did you ever read Profiles in Courage, the book that Kenny?
Fantastic, yes.
Okay. I read it in high school, and then I read it a couple of years ago, and I had a very different experience reading it, because when I read it in high school, it felt wonderful and noble. It's the story of 13 United States senators, all white men, of course, who 12 lost re-election, 1 lost the nomination for president, which is all he wanted. And when I read it a couple of years ago, I kept saying to myself, well, you could have done this, and you could have done that, and you could have done this. I don't get very excited by noble failure anymore. Now, saying that, the whole idea of having purpose is that there's something that you're willing to die for. And that's what makes it risky, is because there is a risk, and each one of us has made a risk calculation in our personal lives and in our professional lives about how hard we're going to push and how far we're going to go. And what you're asking those principals, administrators, and teachers to do is not go from 0 to 60, but just go from 10 to 12 or to 20 to 25. Just to torque it up a little bit and do it, take smart risks in smart ways. So we're not asking people to self-immolate. We're asking people to just push a little harder than they have been willing to do in the past, to take smart risks in smart ways on behalf of something they care about.
So as a metaphor, they're holding steady to get high enough to have discomfort, but not too high to explode. That they're willing to hold steady to the idea that I am going to engage in this conflict. And by engaging, I'm not putting in solutions and solving. I'm actually, for sake of a better word, I guess, being in the moment and enjoying the moment. Watch us struggle.
Yes, as knowing where we're trying to get to, or where I'm hoping that we will get to, in a general enough way so that you can make mid-course corrections and you can see the opportunity to get to B1 and B2 instead of B.
Yeah, absolutely. So our time is up. So thank you for
the opportunity, Kendall. What you're doing is exciting and important.
It's both ways. Thank you.
Thanks.